I want to congratulate the Community Life Project for putting together this forum to reflect on the imperative of free, credible, and peaceful elections and the critical role religious leaders and faith communities must play in making this happen. I commend the organizers for this initiative, and I pray that our discussions here today, along with similar initiatives that are ongoing in our country, may indeed contribute towards mobilizing all stakeholders to commit themselves to achieving free, credible, and especially violence-free general elections in only a couple of weeks from now. My dear friends, the ethical and moral imperative of credible elections is a very critical topic that is calling for attention in our society today, as indeed many who are engaged in contemporary Nigerian politics do not seem to realize that there are ethical and moral dimensions to all political conduct. Many Nigerians do not seem to recognize that almost all political, economic, and legal issues that we are confronted with in our society today are also moral and ethical issues. Many Nigerians who camouflage as religious leaders or as religious people do not seem to recognize that the looting of national resources, the looting of state or local government treasury for the purpose of buying party chiefs, for the purpose of the intimidation, killing, and maiming of opponents, and the destruction of their property, multiple registration and multiple voting, substitution of candidates' names, diversion of electoral material, selling of voters' cards, stashing and outright stealing of voter boxes, falsification of figures, declaration of false results, and the favoring of one candidate against another by agents of the law, corrupt deals, and judicial malpractices at the election tribunals, etc. These are not simply electoral offenses. They are not simply an assault on universally accepted democratic principles. Many Nigerian Christians and Muslims do not seem to recognize that these are not just malpractices, but that over and above all, they are a violation of the elementary ethical and moral principles of truth, justice, equity, fairness, honesty, integrity, respect for the sanctity of life and the dignity of every human being, which all our religions profess. Such violation of moral and ethical principles is known by Christians as acts of sin and iniquity, or damnable works of darkness. No one who engages in any of the above electoral offenses can lay claim to any measure of religiosity or spirituality. Such unscrupulous persons who have no qualms of conscience are truly not religious people, no matter how many religious practices they are engaged in. Such unscrupulous politicians, such unscrupulous political godfathers, such unscrupulous party agents and party thugs, they constitute an evil force in the society, which all religious authorities must denounce in no equivocal terms, and which agents of the law must expose and sanction appropriately in accordance with the extant laws, if we are ever going to make progress as a people or find peace, security, and stability as a nation. I have at the end of my paper a number of scriptural passages which those who receive the paper can see later. Exodus 18:21, select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, who are trustworthy, men who hate dishonest gain. Exodus 20:16, you shall not give false witness against your neighbor. Exodus 23:1, do not spread false report, fake news. Do not help a wicked man by being a malicious witness. Deuteronomy 16:19-20, do not pervert justice or show partiality. Do not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the righteous. Follow justice and justice alone, so that you may live and possess the land that the Lord is giving you. Leviticus 19:11, do not steal, do not lie, do not deceive one another. Proverbs 6:16-20, there are 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that are detestable to him: haughty eyes, lying tongues, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked schemes, feet that are quick to rush into evil, a false witness who pours out lies, and a man who stirs up dissension among the brothers, and so on. There are many other passages that you may want to look at. Now, on June 15 to 17, 2007, the Protestant Academy in Loccum, Germany, had cause to host an international workshop that brought together stakeholders from Nigeria and Germany to brainstorm on the Nigerian problematic. Under the rather curious theme, quote, Nigeria, too rich for dignity and law. And coming shortly after the flawed 2007 general elections in Nigeria, the workshop was an occasion to focus attention on the contradiction of the Nigerian state and attempt to draw out some recommendations on the way forward. At this conference held in Loccum, one Heinrich Bergstrasser, a German participant who had spent many years researching on Nigeria, observed that Nigerians are an extremely creative and constructive people, but that there is in the country what he called a destructive undercurrent. A destructive undercurrent that accounts for the fragile balance which has been the fate of the country since its independence from the British. What, according to this speaker, is missing is, I quote, some initial spark that will turn the fragile balance closer towards the first stage of nation building. Unfortunately, whatever this initial spark may be, it has remained elusive, and in my opinion, the widespread acrimony and banditry that often attend our national elections do tend to render the fragile balance of our country even more precariously fragile with each succeeding election. Many of our countrymen and women continue to approach politics with a killer's touch. Party primaries at state and federal levels have often been an exercise in high-level brigandage, in which the infrastructures of state are used to intimidate the opposition, and looted resources of state are distributed openly to buy the allegiance of Congress delegates. And as could be expected, the results have often gone in favor of the highest bidder. There is widespread lack of truth and justice, and a prevailing culture of fraud in the political mechanisms and processes nearly across the board. The cumulative result is an increasingly high number of litigations in our courts, arising principally from party primaries and a preponderance of anger and frustration among the aspirants to political office. These days, political parties are dangerously split into warring factions, poisoning the polity and heightening the tension in the land. And as election approaches, there is threat of a major breakdown in law and order, as many incidents of violence involving loss of precious lives and destruction of property have already been recorded in different parts of the country. Many in the Nigerian political elite club do prepare for elections as if for war. As part of their preparation for election, they import shiploads of arms and ammunition large enough to prosecute a civil war. And they recruit poor and helpless Nigerian youth as foot soldiers, to the consternation of the generality of the people and the international community. For a cross-section of professional politicians, elections are indeed a do-or-die affair. And desperation is the name of the game. Is this not what we are witnessing all over the place today? It is instructive that one of those present with me in Germany in the year 2007 at the workshop referred to earlier was Professor Atahiru Jega, the former INEC chairman. In his own paper, he described the succession of Nigerian leaders in the following words, and I quote, these are the words of Jega in 2007. With very few exceptions, our crop of so-called leaders have essentially been self-serving rulers, some even despots. They lack vision, they lack focus, selflessness, and even enlightened self-interest. Most of our so-called leaders are unimaginably corrupt. They are greedy, they are vindictive, they are callous, and in many fundamental respects, they are senseless and even reckless. There is perhaps no other country in the world where power corrupts as absolutely as power corrupts in Nigeria. This was 2007. 12 whole years after such a damning moral judgment on the Nigerian political elite, the situation is not much different. We can argue that in fact it is worse. True, Nigerians of integrity and credibility have little chance in contemporary Nigerian politics as greedy merchants of power, contract chasers, mediocre functionaries, ethnic irredentists, religious bigots, and common criminals have often taken control of the political machinery and captured the Nigerian state, forcing the men and women of reason and conscience to disengage. Many knowledgeable and principled Nigerians who, in saner climes, should assume the responsibility of leadership at all levels can often not make sense out of the elite madness and corporate death wish that we witness in our society today. And so, they have become cynical, apathetic, despondent, and resentful. Our society is today plagued by pathological greed for money and mindless lust for power. Our national security is criminally undermined by high-level corruption and crass indiscipline at all levels. It was St. Augustine, the 4th century philosopher and mystic, who declared, and I quote, "A state or a government that does not function according to the rules of justice will be nothing but a bunch of thieves or a gang of robbers." Such governments are now referred to as rogue regimes. A rogue government, an illegitimate government, or a government with a stolen mandate can only hasten rather than reverse our descent into anarchy. For, as Proverbs chapter 29 verse 2 says, when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when the wicked rule, the people groan. And in verse 18 it says, where there is no vision, Where there is no leadership integrity, the people perish. If the next round of elections turn out to be another exercise in elite brigandage, then as a people we are doomed. In the best case scenario, the level of anger in the land will increase. Our courts and tribunals will be flooded with litigations that will render government practically dysfunctional. Much more sophisticated weapons may find their way into the hands of thugs and criminally minded people, and the plight of the generality of the people will be worse than ever before. In the worst case scenario, violence will erupt in many flashpoints across the country, such as to render the country so ungovernable that the ongoing terrorist insurgency in the Northeast, the herdsmen violence across a number of states, and the incidence of violent attacks during recent political party primaries and campaign rallies may be only a dress rehearsal for an eventual total breakdown of law and order. At this point, we can quickly shout, God forbid, but we recognize the wisdom in the saying that unless a people change their course, they will end up where they are headed. Unless a people change their course, they will end up where they are headed. Free, fair, and credible elections are an element of social morality, an ingredient of the rule of law, and an imperative of good governance, stability, peace, and progress. If, therefore, the forthcoming general elections turn out to be another exercise in elite brigandage, then the political elite and their co-conspirators in INEC, in the security agencies, in the bar and in the bench, and in the religious communities must be held responsible for the crime of underdeveloping the Nigerian people at this point in history. Failure to execute the remaining stages of the electioneering process with all civility and justice and with utmost commitment to peace and security of lives and property will result in an increase of the level of anger in the land. The Nigerian situation is, however, even at this point, it is not irredeemable. We read in 2 Chronicles 7:14, if the people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray and seek my presence and turn from their evil ways. Nigerians believe in prayer, but they have forgotten the other phrase, and turn from their evil ways. I myself will hear them from heaven, forgive their sins, and restore their land. Nigerians are not a different breed of human beings from citizens elsewhere, such as Singapore and Malaysia and South Africa or Ghana. Many of us do not believe that Nigeria is so difficult to organize or lead onto peaceful coexistence, political stability, and economic prosperity. Yet, if this country of over 180 million people must make a headway, if the progressive decay in the polity must be halted, if the descent into anarchy in Nigeria must be averted, if, in the words of Heinrich Bergstrasser, the fragile balance must be tilted towards the first stage of nation building, then it cannot be business as usual. If today the Nigerian people, including politicians, INEC officials, judges and lawyers, law enforcement agents, if they experience the much needed conversion and toe the line of sanity and integrity, we may yet pull back from the brink of disaster that now stares us in the face. The desired change will come about only when the various stakeholders in the Nigerian project, including religious leaders and faith communities, when we staunchly reject the ignominious status quo that throws up for leadership positions men and women of base character and dubious wealth. The desired change will definitely not happen without the agencies of state whose principal responsibility it is to ensure compliance with the rules of the engagement. If these critical sectors do not undergo a major ethical and moral transformation in the discharge of their duties, then as a people we are doomed. If in the course of the forthcoming elections and other future exercises, custodians and agents of the law could be bribed, if they could be bought over, if they could be rented and twisted by unscrupulous and desperate politicians to violate the integrity of the electoral process as easily as has been the case in the past, then there is very little chance of a better Nigeria emerging soon. We need a shift in our leadership orientation that will be anchored on a new culture of patriotism and responsibility in governance, and sustained by transparency and accountability, where politicians, public office holders, civil servants, security agents, religious leaders, civil society groups, and the members of the public, yes, all members of the public, where they will engage the political process with the highest ethical and moral standards and the most noble democratic principles. We need a major reform of the various security and law enforcement agencies and the retraining and reorientation of their officers and men so that they may begin to be more accountable to the generality of the Nigerian people, in whom actually resides sovereignty, rather than continue to see themselves as only accountable to and protective of the interests of the ruling elite at any particular time. Indeed, the generality of Nigerians have enormous task ahead. Those of us who have had to put up with a succession of punitive overlords in the corridors of power will not arrive at the promised land without some effort on our part. We must wake up from our slumber and reaffirm our belief in the sovereign power of the people. The leadership of religious organizations, Christians and Muslims and others, must resist the temptation to engage in open partisan politics. But instead, we must maintain dignified neutrality in our public pronouncements. We must break out of our accustomed reactive disposition and become more proactive, engaging the leadership more constructively and demanding the highest standards of probity and accountability from public office holders, helping to build a new culture of service and nurturing a new character of governance for the Nigerian nation. We require indeed a paradigm shift, and this paradigm shift must begin with ensuring the sanctity of the electoral process and the character and conduct of elections, as no illegitimate government can superintend the moral and ethical revolution that Nigeria desperately needs today. No illegitimate government can superintend the moral and ethical revolution that we need today. I'll give you an example. Recently, last week or the week before, we were discussing somewhere and somebody said, look, if they give you money, take it and then vote how you want to vote. I said, that is corruption. You cannot change a corrupt system by corrupt means. So I will not tell people, if they give you money, take it and then vote your conscience. Which conscience? You don't have conscience for taking the money anyway. You cannot change a corrupt system by corrupt means. If you are going to go to equity, you go to equity with clean hands. Yes, the redemption of the Nigerian society must be anchored on such high ethical and moral standards that should ordinarily be championed, nurtured, and inculcated by religious leaders and faith communities in a country like ours that is often acclaimed as one of the most religious in the world. Nigerians indeed like to see themselves as very religious, and our environment is overwhelmed and awash with outward religious activities, prayer vigils, street crusades, screaming billboards, numerous preaching sessions on radio and TV, and hundreds of thousands going on pilgrimage every year. In recent years, warehouses have been turned to prayer houses, and even government offices, boardrooms, and banking halls are easily transformed to sanctuaries for daily devotion. Muslims and Christians are daily In spite of being involved in so much religious activity, Muslims and Christians are daily implicated in acts of petty and grand corruption, in the contravention of the rule of law, and in acts of executive lawlessness, examination malpractice, tax evasion, contract irregularities, swearing to false affidavits, violation of traffic regulations, and sundry electoral malpractice, including the prosecution of election violence. We must take responsibility for what becomes of our country. Each one of us must undergo a conversion experience. And we religious and faith communities need to wake up and do what we must within our sphere of influence to help change the people's perception of politics and governance and the processes and procedures for orderly change of government in the modern world. Nigerians need to be taught a fresh new lesson on leadership as service, and there is no better group than religious organizations to teach this. Nigerians need to be taught that leadership is not a kind of conquest and enslavement of the people. We need a fresh new perception of politics as the noble art of negotiating the stewardship of a society along the ethical and moral parameters of truth, justice, equity, transparency, and accountability, and not an exercise in high-level brigandage. Religious leaders must play a critical role in this much-needed reorientation of our people. Our sacred scriptures have all the ethical and moral codes needed to teach the required lessons and spearhead the desired change of orientation. Nigerians make a lot of noise in the name of religion, but our lives betray a near total lack of the fear of God. The ethical and moral teachings of our various religions remain intact, as could be found in the Hebrew and Christian Bible, in the Muslim Quran or Hadith, and in the Hindu Gita. It is not difficult to see that the practical lives of many so-called religious people in our society run contrary to the standards in the Christian Bible. If followed, our society will be different from the way it is. Religious leaders and faith communities need to constantly advocate for and help the various institutions of state put in place new arrangements that will ensure that the path to public service are not as smooth and attractive as they are today for rogues, thieves, and brigands. That the gains of public office are not as rewarding as they are today for men and women of easy virtue who have no business in leadership, but who are simply gunning for the key of the national treasury. The desired change will come about only when the various stakeholders in Nigeria, including religious leaders and faith communities, stoutly reject the ignominious status quo that throws up such people. Finally, the time is running out for the Nigerian leaders and people. With the widespread disengagement and bitterness in the land today, and with the violent culture already entrenching itself in several parts of the country, there are ominous signs in the horizon of an impending implosion, a popular revolt, or the revenge of the poor. For indeed, as presently constituted, the superstructure in place in Nigeria is only a pack of cards that will come crashing down. But if today the people, including Christians and Muslims, politicians and people and followers, if we experience much needed conversion, we may yet pull back from disaster. There appears to me to be only one way out of the present mess: the way of ethical and moral revolution. Thank you.